Hello, my name is Pierre Yeoman Jr. I am a junior here at Arizona State University, and I'm the vice president of the Assyrian Studies Association. Before our amazing Assyrian academic, Dr. Sargon Donabed, comes up and speaks here, I'd like to discuss Philip Safo Center's work on Genocide Awareness Week. Here at ASU, the Safo Center Arizona chapter has put together a wonderful photo exhibit in the room next door, displaying the life and the state of affairs of the Assyrian, people at the time of our genocide, which is known as Safo. This genocide was committed in 1915 by the Ottoman Turks and their local allies in the region. The Assyrian portion goes into detail about the massacres that occurred all across the different Assyrian regions, which would be like Urmia, Salamas, Hakkari, Van, Kharkut, Urfa, and Turapin. For me, this genocide is a personal affair. I trace my ancestry back to the high mountains of Hakkari. Both my paternal great-grandfathers, Hurmis and Solmo, they were born in Hakkari in a very small village called Mazra. They both had to flee their village at a very, very young age. And their village was burnt to the ground and destroyed, and nothing is left of it. But one was forced to flee to Persia and then eventually the Soviet Union. And then both ended up in Iraq at a certain point. Today, I stand here a living, breathing descendant of these survivors in what I can confidently call the genocide. I speak our language, I practice our traditional Christian religion, and I try to practice our cultural traditions. I refuse to be a race. Thank you for giving me part of your time to discuss my family, and feel free to check out the exhibit right outside this hall. You can see it right on your right. We are also offering a free book for students, maybe students that are here regarding the Assyrian genocide. It's called The History of the Assyrian Nation in the 20th Century. I now invite Dr. Nathan Betunadam to come and introduce Professor Donabed. Thank you.
Here and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Nathan Betunadam. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Arizona and a member of the Assyrian American Cultural Organization of Arizona, a sponsoring organization along with the Safo Center Arizona chapter and the Assyrian Studies Association of Arizona. I'm also an Assyrian American and a descendant of genocide survivors. I'm grateful to the Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation for the 11th Annual Genocide Awareness Week, a week-long event seeking to address how we as a global society confront violent actions and threats of genocide and mass atrocities throughout the world, while also looking to the past for guidance and to honor those affected by genocide. I am here to introduce to you our speaker for today's lecture, Dr. Sargon Donabed, Professor of History and Cultural Studies at Roger Williams University, whose talk is titled The Assyrians, Simele, and its Aftermath, a Narrative of Resilience. Professor Donabed holds a PhD in Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations from the University of Toronto and a postgraduate degree in Anthrozoology or Animal Studies from Canisius College. He is the co-founder and board member of the Assyrian Studies Organization, Assyrian Studies Association, an organization that promotes the academic study of the Assyrian heritage by supporting their interdisciplinary research, teaching, and intellectual collaboration. He is a prolific scholar on indigenous and marginalized communities in the Middle East, an expert on the perennial history of Assyrian and Mesopotamian culture, and a skillful writer who produces and preserves Assyrian history through re-enchanting and storytelling. Dr. Donabed is published in a variety of journals from Folklore to National Identities and the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and is the author of Reforging a Forgotten History, Iraq and the Assyrians in the 20th Century, published by Edinburgh University Press. He is also the creator and editor for the book series Alternative Histories, Narratives from the Middle East and Mediterranean, and he is currently penning 2 fantasy series, First, an epic fantasy entitled Of Beasts and Mischief, the Unremembered, and the second, a young adult tale, Scion of the Ancients, an alternate reality based on the epic of Gilgamesh. Please welcome Dr. Sargon Donabed.
Thank you very, very much for that introduction. I want to thank you all for being here. And first and foremost, thank you to ASU, to Tim, to the folks here who made all of Genocide Awareness Week possible, to Dr. Donabed, to Dr. Romina Jeju and the Seiko Center. Thank you to Pierre for that wonderful introduction, and to, of course, everyone here as well. I would also like to acknowledge that as we know, as many of you already know, we stand today here at ASU, which is the traditional home of many indigenous peoples. I wish to offer my sincere thanks that I am here and able to present on these lands, especially to the elders past, present, future, specifically to those of Salt River Valley, and the 23 recognized nations that call Arizona home, but not only those, also those who remain unrecognized. We tend to forget that there are many communities that also go unrecognized these days. So my presentation today is on the Assyrians, Simele, and its aftermath, the narrative of resilience. I'd like folks that are unaware of the Assyrians or don't know too much about the background of the Assyrians to bear with me. I'll give a little bit of background to who the Assyrians are so that there is some understanding. So I apologize if I go back into too much detail, but I think I'll try to set it up as best as possible. So to use the simplest definition, and this definition is not one that I care for. I do not like definitions for communities. I think they are problematic. I think they box people in when definitions, when communities and identities should be open and flowing and open to change and layered and a variety of other nuanced things. But let me offer a basic definition from Agnes Corbani's book of 1995 with some amendments that I have made. So Corbani says that the Assyrians are remnants of the people of ancient Mesopotamia, succeeding the Sumero-Akkadian and Babylonians as one continuous civilization. Most belong to one of four churches, the Chaldean Uniate, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Catholic Church, and the Assyrian Church of the East, with also Yazidi, Jewish, and Muslim communities, especially in and around Diyarbakir in Turkey. Now, due to ethnic and political conflicts in the Middle East, most are better known by their ecclesiastical designations, and most Assyrians continue to use classical Syriac, which is a development of Aramaic, in their liturgies in the Christian churches, and the majority of them speak and read and write a modern dialect of that language. They constitute, at the time, remember, 1995, they constitute the third largest ethnic group in Iraq, with communities in Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Iran, Russia, Armenia. At this point, this is my correction to Corbani, or I should say update, most Assyrians now exist in diaspora setting all over the world, from Australia to North America. Now, to give you a little bit of background about Simele, see if I can, there we go, okay. The region that we're talking about. So this is the region of the Assyrian people in the Middle East. The Mediterranean is on your left here. And this is a map that was created by General Petros Ilia after the First World War. And this shows the Assyrian country of northern Mesopotamia. You can see Malatya and Kharput that Pierre mentioned up on the top. Forgetting we have a laser here. Up here on the top left. And then you can see Urmia and Salamis in the plains all over here, and then all the way down to ancient Nimrud in this area. So this was the traditional homeland of the Assyrians and had been for at least some 2,000, 2,500 years. Most of those villages do not exist today, or if they do exist, there are very few Assyrians that still live there. Now, Simele, or the region of Simele, which is in Iraq today, Here's a map, an Assyrian map. This is the area that we're going to be talking about today, which is in and around the first event that I'm going to set up for you is here. This is on the border of Syria and Iraq, right in this area. And we're going to be looking at Simele, which is a small village here, but it's also sort of a districted area in Iraq today. Here's a little bit of a better one where you can see Simele. This is the region of Iraq. Again, this is going to be the region that we're going to speak about. And then this is where the major massacre occurred. But a lot of the areas are going to be affected as well. So I'm going to bounce back and forth so that you can see them. So here's again the Simele district, and these are going to be targeted villages alongside that one small village that's also named Simele. So I just want to have everyone understand that, excuse me, Simele is both a village but also a district area. So it sometimes gets a bit confusing. But again, this is all of these are places in Iraq. As you can see, this is sort of the center. This is Simele, that particular village or town, I guess today. And these are all various villages that were affected. So the initial destruction of the Iraqi Assyrian village of Simele, sometimes referred to as the Simele massacre or Assyrian incident by denialists, and the looting and razing of numerous villages in the region of August, or the time of August 1933, was one of two major events in the living memory of a young Raphael Lemkin, which influenced his presentation to the League of Nations in 1933 in Madrid. At the time, Lemkin would argue that the issue, this particular issue that he was understanding and seeing and had existed around the world at this time, should be known as a crime according to international law. Of course, many of you are already familiar with this, and this came in two parts. The law was dealing with the crime of barbarism and the crime of vandalism, right? This balance between the two. Barbarism is sort of just the physical killing, of course, and vandalism was that cultural genocide, right? Destruction of cultural property, of ethnocultural property, sometimes also called ethnocide, of course. Now, this would eventually lead to the Genocide Convention of 1948. At the time, it was not accepted, but just so folks understand this, Lemkin went just after, within 2 months of the Simele genocide, was when he presented in Madrid. Now, this presentation reinserts this particular event of Simele into the history of the Middle East. The event remains a foundational act of the newly created Iraqi polity and its successive treatment of indigenous and marginalized communities in the country. It will also shed light on inter- and intra-communal issues, which we can talk about more after, and how even despite this event, despite its destruction, or perhaps because of it, galvanized the Assyrian community to actually rise above and beyond that and find a home in Iraq, despite unfailing marginalization. Much of the research that you'll see today is drawn from US and British and League of Nations archival research and documentation, as well as previously unexplored Assyrian oral accounts, eyewitness accounts, narratives from families of the event in their native Assyrian language, including some interviews with survivors. So I'm going to set just one of the major events up, because what leads to the Simele massacre is going to be this particular issue that's going to happen here in northern Iraq. So in this area, which is Deir Abun and Peshawar, while the Assyrians are, in this general area of Iraq, in northern Iraq, after World War I, and I'll explain this in a second, this area is going to be where this first major incident occurs. So, following World War I and the genocide of the Assyrian people, which claimed 1/3 to 2/3 of the Assyrian population, Assyrians found themselves in search of a home, but at the mercy of major powers. This included the colonial powers of England and France, but also Sunni Arab elites in the region, as well as various Kurdish and Turkish tribes. Now, let me be crystal clear. There were many different Assyrian communities in the region at the time. Assyrians were not, nor are they, monolithic. No community is. Some were members of the Church of the East, some were not. Some were from the Haikari and Urmia region that I showed you earlier, who ended up in what became Iraq after the Great War. There were some who lived in the region of Iraq for thousands of years prior to the war. The region of Barwari Bala is a great example of that, in this whole area of northern Iraq, in the Safna area, all the way to the border. Because of course, borders didn't exist prior to this time period. So many were from these different areas. There were also members of different church affiliations, as I mentioned, Church of the East. There were Catholics or Chaldeans, famous ones like the Rassam family. Many of you may have heard of Hormuz Rassam, who was the, I usually say the co-worker with Austin Henry Layard. People tend to call him his helper and aide, typical Orientalism, to be honest, but this is Hormuz Rassam of the famous Rassam family in Mosul, in ancient Nineveh. There were also Jacobites who were later called Syrian or Syrian Catholics and Syrian Orthodox. Now, for the purpose of the presentation, since the Assyrians faced the brunt of what happens in Simele were those formerly of the Hakkari region in southeast Turkey, we will focus mostly on them. So this is Julamerk, which is the region of Hakkari. These are the areas that were going to be, these are the Assyrians from these areas that would come down and settle in these areas after World War I. If you recall, Pierre mentioned Mazra, which is in the tribal area of Toma, which is in the Hakkari range, just as an example. So folks coming in from there, and if the area of Urmia here, were two sort of major movements. Hakkari coming this way, Hakkari to Urmi, Urmi into the Bakuba refugee camp, and then into Baghdad area. So two different sort of movements of some Assyrian groups into what eventually became known as Iraq. By 1931, so this is following the war and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Assyrians, the killing of hundreds of thousands more. Assyrians, up to 1931, there was a permanent mandates commission of the League of Nations, which decided to allow Iraq, this newly minted Iraqi state, or under the British mandate at the time, admission as an independent sovereign state into the League of Nations, with the recommendation that it guarantees certain rights to its minorities. Now, it is at this time that the new narrative begins to show itself, of course. The Assyrians of Hakkari, most of whom were never really settled after World War I, and we'll talk about where they were, and worked for the British as guards for their air bases, were part of what was called the Iraq levies at the time. And anyone's familiar with British colonial activities would borrow people from different areas. India, if you think about what happened with various Indian groups, were brought into the British army and then utilized in different places, to keep the peace. The Assyrians were used in different areas of Iraq, in Hinadi, in Habaniya, and other areas to basically keep the peace and to defend the air bases. This was a very common thing. Now, it wasn't just Assyrians. The Iraq levies was actually first called the Arab levies, then called the Arab and Kurdish levies. Then eventually it became sort of a general levy, Iraq levies, where everyone started to be incorporated. But by the time of the 1930s, most other groups in Iraq started to either go back to certain territories, certain Kurdish groups went back to their territories or encompassed or incorporated into the state. Most of the Arabs were incorporated into the state, the Assyrians were not. Especially the ones who had high-ranking positions in the Iraq levies, they were actually not allowed to join unless they wanted to join as sort of at the grunt level, as just sort of an everyday fighter. So in this particular situation with the Iraq levies, the Assyrians feared that the termination of the mandate would mean another brunt of violence against them. And so they had that particular worry. Now, this was especially true of those of the Hakkari Mountains who were aligned with the Church of the East Patriarch, who was known as Mar Ishai Shum. Now, at this point in Iraq, two major factions among the mountaineers developed. There were one group who felt that Iraq without British protection would be disastrous and desired to re-immigrate to Hakkari, something that they tried in 1924 and actually were repulsed by the Turks and Kurds in the region. And those that had given up particular hopes of returning to their traditional homes in the Hakkari and through new settlement in Iraq with citizenship would become preferable. Now, as the handover of Iraq from the Brits to the ruling Sunni Arab elite under King Faisal of the Hijaz was imminent, Assyrians loyal to the Patriarch were deeply concerned. Faisal knew that Iraqi people did not yet exist. In fact, we have a lot of his communications saying that we don't have a true Iraqi people yet. And it seemed that the Assyrians at the time could become the perfect unifying problem. Typically, this happens with countries that need more national sentiment. Many of us are familiar with Pearl Harbor, for instance, of course, in the United States. Thus, a situation was fostered where a clash with the Assyrians became pretty much inevitable. On the 31st of March, I'm jumping ahead a couple of years because just for an interest of time. By the time we get to March of 1933, the Iraqi levies were heavily Assyrian. And one particular officer, Yaqub Ismail, met with the Qaimakam, or the deputy of the Duhok region, again in northern Iraq. Here's Duhok. You can, I'm going to say you can see it, but of course, unless you can read Assyrian, you're not seeing that. But this is Duhok right here, which is also referred to the Assyrian late flight. Sorry, sometimes things get shuffled around. But this is the Duhok region right here, okay? The city of Duhok, which is also known by the Assyrian name of Nohadra. So as this became something that was going to, or feared that something would occur, Yaqub met with the Qaimakam, or the deputy, known as Mekki Beg el-Shirbiti of Duhok. Now, according to Yaqub's own memoirs, Mekki Beg responded positively to his suggestions that the Assyrians would have some sense of autonomy and perhaps even immigrate outside of the region, perhaps to French-controlled Syria, which was the idea at the time. So the idea of integration into Iraq became less of a concern, and rather sort of movement out became the focus for many of the Assyrians who were part of the patriarchal faction. From there, Yaqub left to speak with various villages with this new possible idea. Concurrently, by the time we get to May and June of 1933, the government campaigned to urge Iraqis to start to donate particular funds for military supplies, that would be used to quell any possible Assyrian unrest. Now, at approximately the same time, we have communications from Major Arnold Wilson, who recommended the summoning of the patriarch to Baghdad to actually detain him there, and stated that all necessary steps should be taken to oblige the patriarchal family to accept any resettlement at the time. The idea was to resettle the Assyrians a little bit further to the south, typically in this general area. Now, some Assyrians were okay with that. The patriarchal faction was not. There was a desire to keep autonomy. There was constantly a pushback from the Iraqi regime, but also from the British government. That was not something that they had wanted. So there was a particular idea to settle them in an area called Dashtazi, the Dashtazi settlement. But on May 22nd of 1933, Marshamoon indulged the request to meet with Hikmat Suleiman, who is a newly appointed settlement expert, and British Major Thompson in Baghdad. Now, at the time, the talks deteriorated. Following the breakdown of the talks, Baghdad decided that they would retain Marshamoon in custody. Now, this was infuriating to the Assyrian population. Major Thompson, however, went directly to the Mosul region. He spoke with 40 Assyrians concerning this particular issue. 36 of these major Assyrian leaders decided that they would agree with whatever Marshamoon had decided. The remaining 4 said they would agree to whatever settlement the government had proposed. So you can see the split beginning to occur. At the time, Major Thompson recorded that there were 400 families distributed over 31 villages between the Barwari Bala region and Nerwa and Rekan region, who were under the patriarchal authority. Now, the confusing thing for some people is that many of these people actually had lived there for a long time. They came back, or some moved into the territory to sort of bolster the Assyrian population, because these were already Assyrian villages, but it sort of added to the already, the group that was already connected to the patriarch. Now, there became more than 3,500 families formerly of the Haikari, and around 24,000 people that were focused in this area, giving more than 27,500 Assyrians in Iraq who were definitely under Marshamoon's authority and were loyal to his ideas at the time. So to give you some idea of the amount of Haikari Assyrians who were loyal to the cause in that region. Yaqub felt betrayed by the British and felt that if not settled in an autonomous region, they would rather move to the region of French-controlled Syria. Now, a few things happened at this time, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into it too much, but some Assyrians began to move in a particular direction towards leaving the central region here, where again, this is Duhok, and this is the area of Simele, the village of Simele and later town. and to move up here where you get into the area of Deir Abun, the village of Deir Abun, and Feshhabur, which once you're across the river here, you enter into French-controlled Syria, okay? So the idea was to move into French-controlled Syria and to ask them if it was possible to settle in the region. What occurred, though, was, of course, armed Assyrians meeting, going across the border, and as they came back, rejected by the French, they came back across the border and they were met by the Iraqi army. Now, to give you a little bit of how this occurred, I'm just going to explain just a couple pieces. Because the regime of Iraq feared the general atmosphere of the government defiance of the Assyrians, and also actually at the same time, the Shia to the south, the Assyrians continued their attempts to move across the border. They felt that this was the time that they could do it. July 25th and 26th, 190 men attempted to cross the border. Some were disarmed once they reached the border, and other were, when they reached the border and then moved across, others were disarmed and let go. So I guess there were a few of them at the time, according to British accounts, that were retained and actually had to stay there. Some were, their ammunition was taken and they crossed the border. So we know some of them made it to French-controlled Syria to speak with the French. Now, most agreed, though, that some Assyrians had to remain in Iraq and would wait along with their families. Some of them remained back in the Simele region, and some were starting to settle in that area or around Dohuk. Some stayed up here and when they were disarmed, but the rest of those 190 that went across went to speak with the French. Now, in Syria, French authorities reneged on their earlier promise to Assyrians and turned them back due to a leaked decree concerning the illegality of the effort. But they promised that they would allow them to re-enter Iraq without incident. Iraqi forces, on the other hand, on this side of the border, on the Iraqi side of the border, had other ideas. Now, when they came to Iraqi forces determined either to disarm the Assyrians or to eliminate them, and they began firing at the returnees with machine guns as they crossed the east side of the Tigris. 5,000 Iraqi soldiers and police, including support aircraft, were brought against fewer than 800 Assyrians, those on one side of the border, and the 190 went onto the other side. Now, at the end of the skirmish, there were 13 Assyrians that were counted dead and 11 wounded, and there were dozens of Iraqi army casualties. Army battalions of the Iraqi government around the Zahul region between the 5th and the 9th of August began actually rounding up Assyrians. So any place that they could find Assyrians in the north in Zahul, along the border area, this is Zahul right here. In the area of Zahul, they began rounding up Assyrians and detaining them. Many of them were not seen from again. Now, the French authorities apparently, according to French sources, gave 1,500 people that would be settled in the region, gave them the opportunity to do that. Now, that would come a little bit later, but we can get back to that. Now, when news of this debacle happened in Feshhabur and Deir Abun into the central authority of Baghdad, fear was replaced by rage, and animosity against Assyrians became a living, breathing reality throughout the country. It was cried out that in the highest circles, rid me of this turbulent priest and let all of the Assyrian men be killed, but spare the women and children, as the eyes of the world would be upon us. Let Arabs and Kurds be raised against Assyrians. Let trouble be stirred up in Syria against the treacherous French as well. At that time, there was a propaganda campaign within Iraq. And by August, early August, more than 230 anti-Assyrian articles were published. The Ministry of Education solicited funds from students and teachers to purchase a tank, while Arab nationalist neighbors in Syria proposed to send funds for planes or tanks to be used in anti-Assyrian operations. The propaganda machine that reported the armed Assyrians returning from Syria mutilated the bodies of Iraqi soldiers, gave further fear to the country to have some sort of a response. Now, at that time, during the weeks preceding the major massacre that happened in Simele, Assyrians from the south of Simele began moving into the village since they were suffering continuous raiding by nearby tribes. So this area, folks began moving up. This is also a major Assyrian center of Al-Qush, just so you can see this particular area. So from this area in the south began moving up into Simele. On Friday, August 11th, 2 lorry loads of police from Duhok visited Simele armed with machine guns. On the same morning, following the entrance of the police, between 300 and 500 Assyrians came into the village, brought in by through the south. When they arrived, they were asked to surrender their arms to the Iraqi military, who then, quote, proceeded to massacre them with the machine guns and rifle fire. Aside from 1 wounded man, there were no survivors of that 300, end quote. All the males in the village that day were killed. To quote Colonel Stafford, British colonel, a cold-blooded and methodical massacre of all the men in the village then followed. A massacre for which, in the black treachery in which it was conceived and the callousness with which it was carried out, was as foul a crime as any in the blood-stained annals of the Middle East. The Assyrians had no fight left in them, partly because of their state of mind, to which the events of the past week had reduced them, and largely because they were disarmed. Not that there was any hurry for the troops to do what they did, they had the whole time ahead of them in this massacre. Their opponents were helpless, and there was no chance of any interference from or any quarter whatsoever. The machine guns set up their setups outside of the windows of the houses in which Assyrians had taken refuge. And having trained them on terror-stricken wretches in the crowded rooms, they fired among them until not a man was left standing. In some other instances, the bloodlust of the troops took a slightly more active form, and men were dragged out and shot or bludgeoned to death, and their bodies thrown down in a pile of dead, end quote. This area became the focus. So when you read about the Simele massacre, pretty much this is what you read about, that initial event of 300 to 500 people. What followed, though, was massacres and looting and razing in dozens of villages in the region. Now, these are the majority of ones that you see attacked here. There's some to the further north as well. Now, how do we know about the evidence of what occurred? These are aerial photos from rich air files that were taken in 1933, just after the event. These are unmarked villages. This is one unmarked village of the region. And almost every village was emptied, again, looted, razed. No Assyrians were left in any of these villages. There's another unmarked village in the region. The British by the 22nd, took multiple aerial photos of this. You can see the ruins of another village here. Fourth, this is one that specifically has the data on it. So this is a particular air file of Deccan village. This was taken August 22nd of 1933. This is Bata Shah in Simele in Iraq, in the Simele district of Iraq. This was abandoned and ruined in 1933, and this photo was actually taken in September, so a month later. You can see also here what look like, holes that are littered in the area. Now, I've spoken with a variety of people. Some people have told me that these are what's left from bombings. Other people have said, no, this is a natural part of the topography, which I don't think is the case in the region. It doesn't look the same in any of the other village photos. And we do know that bombs were used, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, where does some of this material come from? Well, I'll give you an example of this is one survivor. This is Ilyas Harun. And the reason I am not using a pseudonym and I'm showing this picture is because he wanted me to. And when I interviewed him in the early 2000s, he gave me this particular quote. Now, I spoke with him for days on end, but this was one thing that stuck with me because it was echoed multiple times. Now, he did show me 2 different places. He was a child when Simele occurred, and he had shrapnel in his arm and also in his face. And he lived with that, of course, as many of our genocide survivors all around the world have had to live with. And what he said to me was, my friends and I saw a plane fly into Simele and start firing on us. We know it wasn't just machine guns, but also from an aerial assault as well. Since the men were being slaughtered, the women began making young boys, including me, look like girls so we would not be killed. On the 3rd day after the killing began, they, some wearing Iraqi uniforms, some not, rounded up some Assyrians and said, either become Muslim or we will kill you. Now, this is something that occurred, and we know this, and this is corroborated by a variety of reports. We also have the United States documents on this, and these are from US Department of State. This is from August 21st, 1933, report on the massacre from Peter Kabenshu, who was living at the time in Iraq. Now, this was piece to the Secretary of State. I just wanted to show you this particular piece. I am informed by Cumberland, who's an American missionary in Duhok, now in Baghdad, upon evidence given to him by eyewitness widow of one of the victims, that the Iraqi army disarmed and then massacred by machine gun more than 300 Assyrians at Simele on August 11th. So we'll see a variety of these start to pop up. This is from the American Consular Services, Wallace Murray. Wallace Murray stated, I have already sent to you the information which I obtained from Captain Degari. So again, this is some stuff from the British, from Captain Leader Reed, who is an Assyrian expert, and others. I wanted to draw your attention to this. I was informed by Mrs. Reed that the Iraqis were preparing for some time for the Assyrian trouble, and that they had carefully excluded that from the territory in which the massacres took place, all British officials and all foreigners of any nationality. Mrs. Reed informed me that the Assyrians who had crossed the Syrian border, taking with them their arms and ammunition, presented a problem to the French, which they did not like at all. The emissaries from Iraq crossed the border, interviewed the French officials and the Assyrian leaders, and promised the Assyrians amnesty if they would return to Iraq. Mrs. Reed further stated that the French then returned their arms, but no ammunition. That the Assyrians, as soon as they crossed the border, ran into a carefully prepared machine gun ambush. So, excuse me, I'm showing this also for the issue of premeditation that existed. Now, when I came across the first Simele article that I had read, there were two articles in the International Journal of Middle East Studies that became very famous, and they're used by people throughout the world. It's a common article that's used. It was by Khalidun Husri, done in two parts, I believe, maybe a third part, if I remember correctly. And it's on Simele. And the paper begins by saying, according to historian Ernst Toller, propaganda is usually, or I should say, that it's usually the propaganda of the victims, history is the propaganda of the victims, history is the propaganda of the perpetrators, excuse me. But in the case of the Assyrian incident, it is the propaganda of the persecuted. And it was very interesting because it sort of set up the general article and how that was going to go. And what it does is basically blame the Assyrians for the incident. Now, this became the article that was utilized by scholars since 1974 for anything that came after it. But I wanted to draw your attention to this because it's very interesting. We have a lot of corroborating evidence that shows that actually not only did the massacre occur, not only were dozens of villages destroyed, over 100 that I counted, not only were thousands of people killed, but also there was premeditation to it. Removing people that weren't Assyrian from the region sounds a lot like premeditation if you're focusing on one group. More premeditation. The premeditated nature of the event was illustrated by the fact that 10 Arab families, now this comes from Raphael Lumpkin's collection that is housed in the Jewish archives. So in this particular piece, 10 Arab families living alongside the 100 Assyrian families in Simele were told to leave prior to the massacre. In addition, the Assyrians were disarmed by, and surrounding Kurdish tribes were given more than 1,000 rifles by the army, by the Iraqi army, to instill fear in those wishing to flee. So the fact seems that the Assyrians were forced to be there. They were brought in by lorry load, we find out. They were disarmed. There was premeditation. So there's a variety of things that are happening. And then we have eyewitness accounts. And to the best of my knowledge, no scholar ever quotes these. Husri does not. Other scholars that I've read do not. Typically, they use just Husri, and they leave it as such. But this is a statement made by Miriam, the wife of David Jindo, excuse me, a corporal in the Iraq levies. And this was from a petition to the League of Nations official. This comes from the official journal. And this was a petition by Marshall, who was the Catholicos, or the patriarch of the Assyrian Churches. So the soldiers that remained in the village found any remaining male person to shoot him down. About in the evening, they entered for particular places. Amongst the women and children, there were nearly about 100 men and grown-up boys who, being without arms to save themselves, had put on women's clothes. So this is interesting. This is the corroboration, one piece of corroboration with Ilyas Harun's commentary to me. They were discovered by the police and the soldiers, and every woman and other person in female dress was examined by soldiers and the police, and they were all killed. I saw the police sergeant also dashing the priest's 2 children of 4 and 6 years of age against the wall because they were clinging to their father and screaming as he was being taken away. Tasha Scion was taken outside where he was joined by another priest, Tasha Sanas, whom the police had found in another house. They were both murdered just below the fort in the front of the house, known as of Hoshab. Hoshab is what they said. Their beards were cut off and their hair was dashed in their mouths. Another piece from Stafford. Here and there in the mountains, they came out with fugitive Assyrians, and every Assyrian they shot out of hand. Clearly now the army had decided that Assyrians, as far as possible, were to be exterminated. So the fact that any Assyrian that they could find, any Assyrian of this particular group, now, of course, they weren't necessarily asking everyone, what group are you a part of? Are you pro-patriarchal faction or not pro-patriarchal faction? So anyone that they felt was part of this group, they were eliminated. Now, what did this mean for the Assyrians? Well, there were various consequences that occurred. And probably the best explanation of the consequences that I've ever found come from American missionary in Duhok, Roger Cumberland. You saw his name before. And in a letter to Peter Cavendish, he stated that Simele had the following consequences. One, the Assyrian warrior reputation has vanished. They had no weapons. Most of their ammunition had been taken. They could not support or protect themselves. And especially now that the British had been offering weaponry to the Iraqi army and local Kurdish tribes, the Assyrians could not fight against that. So the warrior had been destroyed. Second, the tribes have seen with their own eyes that British armed forces, whether by land or air, took no part in recent operations. Excuse me, which is interesting. So now they know that the British are not going to work to protect them. As an addendum to all the stuff that I've read about Assyrians, most scholars also say that Assyrians were like a fifth column. The British helped them. The British were supportive of Assyrians. Well, it became pretty obvious that since 1933, in fact, they were not. Third, that old animosities between Muslims and Christians have been aroused, so more religious violence. Fourth, local significance in Duhok, unless it should spread, that Kurdish tribes have quarreled, so internal fighting with the Kurds, that they've gone out of their area. Fifth, and seemingly an absurd thing, but nevertheless significant, there's a shortage of eligible Kurdish girls at present, and a good bride costs $300. And whether young Kurds would consciously start out to get brides by conquest or not, the situation does make them restless. Sixth, the Simele massacre had gone to show that similar events would destroy Assyrians' confidence in anyone to support them. Now, the 4 points were interesting because they're very typical of responses, I think, to the situation of genocide. But Cumberland's 5th point about young Kurds and women was very important. And the Iraqi army knew this. If all the men in the region were eliminated, then the women and children that remained would have to go somewhere. They would either be forced to marry Kurds, effectively making them Kurdish, especially, and this is short of Kurdish girls of marriage age, or leave the country, since as expressed in the 6 points, or 7, the events had become so bad that the Assyrians were no longer confident in the government. So, in fact, actually, this was sort of the culmination, really, of a very obvious gender-silent campaign to eliminate the Assyrian warrior. And denial, of course, was not consistent with testimony. The Iraqi government denies the massacre, claiming that it was punitive action taken against rebels. The police and the army will not testify to it, though, and there seem to be no male survivors. This is from Peter Cavendish stuff. Also, intimidation would doubtlessly play a role, which we do know. It's a disgrace to talk about the massacres, was what Faisal had said. Not one woman was molested, was a quote that King Faisal of Iraq had given. So there was abject denial of what had occurred. Now, of course, from this is yet another US State Department piece that I came across in National Archives. After killing all the men again, the soldiers stripped the dead, took their things. The better-looking women were mishandled, stripped, and let go. The wife of Yahweh, the supposed leader of the Assyrians who left for Syria, was repeatedly violated, stripped, and let go. And so were her 2 daughters. So not only did it start off as an anti-male gendercidal campaign to eliminate the male warrior, Assyrian warrior, but they were molested. Assyrian women were attacked and were killed. It didn't start off that way necessarily, but it definitely did end that way. Now, analogous cases, I use Srebrenica as one of the analogous cases. This is just an excerpt from a 2004 trial, which states, this is just a piece I just wanted to show folks. I consider that the alleged requirement for proof of intent to destroy the group physically or biologically was met by the disastrous consequences for the family structures on which the Srebrenica part of the Bosnian Muslim group was based. Family structure to Assyrians was the only thing that they had. For a group that had no state, they had no state to belong to. The only connections they had were their family connections. If you take away the family connections from them, you effectively eliminate the Assyrians as a people. And this was a great connection to them. Culpability of the British. On August 7th, 3 days after the fighting began, now this is from Burnett to the Air Ministry. So this is actually stated in the archives. British air officer commanding in Iraq responded to an Iraqi request for assistance by providing 100 bombs for use in military operations against Assyrians. Now, despite the fact that some people did speak against this, it had to be done, according to Burnett, because of the Article 5 of the Anglo-Iraqi Treatment of 1930. No one talks about British culpability. If those who speak about Simele, which are few, talk about British culpability in this. But they gave over 100 bombs to the Iraqi army to utilize against Assyrians, and argued that this was just them fulfilling Article 5. And then, of course, this is an example of some of the Assyrians who made it to Folklore in 1930. This is from 1935. And this was from a piece about requesting recognition for the Scion massacre in 1933 by the Assyrian Pulse Institute. I just want to give you an example of this was pretty much the state of the Assyrians living in the region up to into the early 1930s, but especially those who even made it across. Their life was not luxurious when they made it to French-controlled Syria. They lived in mud brick houses, which they built, and they stayed there up until they were removed, forcibly removed, kidnapped, or killed by ISIS in 2014, 2015. Excuse me. So there are various pieces of fallout that occurred. We know that in the Marching Moons report, there were 138 people that were named originally. Excuse me, I'm coughing from leftover pneumonia. But 138 people were named and 62 villages were looted. And last count, I counted 3,000 to 6,000 Assyrians probably killed, and 121 villages looted and destroyed, and looted, razed, and forcibly abandoned. I bring this to people's attention because this was very interesting. When we have this Assyrian narrative that begins to develop, there is a narrative about Assyrians being not native to Iraq. And this was a quote by Arab nationalist George Antonius. The Assyrians are the majority of Iraqis, an alien race with an alien religion bound to Iraq by no strong ties of patriotism or loyalty. So this becomes the new narrative. I'm going to skip these because we don't have a ton of time. But I just wanted to show an example of Assyrian resilience. So 20 years following all of this, 20 to 30 years after that, Assyrians did participate in Iraqi civil society. Most of the Iraqi sports institutions in the country, including their first male soccer team, had three Assyrian members that were a part of it. In 1955, excuse me, an Assyrian sports club was opened in Baghdad, one of the first that existed in the region. Had a men's soccer and basketball team, and later incorporated women's teams. They created an Assyrian aid club called Nadi al-Rahma al-Alturiya, which was also done throughout, or done from the sports club. They had drama clubs, drama groups that existed. Just going to show you this. This is this young man became a famous soccer player. His name was Shidrak Yusuf. This woman was the founder of women's sports volleyball in Iraq. Her name is Alice Yukanna, who started actual women's professional volleyball in Iraq. And this became famous Assyrian singer Ashab Siddiqus today. In fact, the Assyrians were so good and so much a part of civil society that most of their civil society organizations were made up of people who were descendants of those same people who were killed or forcibly exiled, either in 1919, by 1919, so during the First World War and the Assyrian genocide, or due to the Simele massacre. And despite that, despite Iraq not wanting them there, government work to the contrary, anti-Assyrian work from a variety of different groups, lack of recognition. In 1960, the Assyrian group club Al-Athuri actually was in a final game to win the Iraqi Cup. But they had to walk off the field, and they walked off the field because they were threatened that if they played and won, something might occur. And so they walked off the field at that time. So just as an example of resilience, and despite that resilience still constantly coming up with sort of a constant pushback. And most Iraqis, any Iraqi today, if you ask any Iraqi, every Iraqi will know this man. Emmanuel Baba Dawood, or Ammul Baba, he was the most, or he is the most beloved sports figure in all of Iraqi history. Ammul Baba was an Assyrian. His family is Assyrian. He became the coach in the mid-2000s for the Iraqi national team. There is not a person who did not like him. His family are descendants of genocide survivors. These are just some pictures of the Assyrian team winning trophies. This is Alice Yukanna again, when the women's team won the Iraq Cup in the area in Baghdad. These are some other pictures of Assyrians sort of establishing themselves in the region. So I wanted to show this as a response, despite the fact that they were sort of pushed to the outskirts and to the margins. They made this major reaction in Iraqi society and became a part of Iraqi society, despite the fact that they were not wanted in many ways in the area. And this is just the last piece because I like this, the way they put it together. So I borrowed it from the Assyrian Wing Bull Soccer Club in Toronto. So thanks to Leif Jatu's piece here. This is a list of actual Assyrians who, probably the most famous Assyrians in soccer in Iraq, probably the most famous soccer players in Iraq. And all of them were Assyrian. And almost all of them were either, Adam Khan, for instance, was on the first Iraqi men's team. Adam Khan was also, interestingly enough, the son of Assyrians who lived in Nadi and in Habaniya. So his family were working for the British at the time. Edison David, Zaya Shawel, just as an example. If you speak to any Iraqi today, this group of Assyrians are probably the most famous people in Iraq, in Iraqi sports history. So I wanted to just conclude with showing this piece of resilience in the face of massacre, displacement, and inability of local people to offer their support, or local governments, I should say, local people are different, of course, local governments to offer support for resettlement and appreciation. And despite the fact that this exists, and all of this history exists, it will be a very difficult process for anyone, including academics, to find any of this information today. Now it's a bit easier, but for years, very few people had pointed to this sort of long history of genocide, resilience, genocide survival, and resilience. So I'll stop there and say thank you, and I'm happy to field any questions. Is it okay if I take the question? Oh, thank you.
I will
Yeah.
relay any questions from the chat from you online.
Absolutely, thank you. Apologies, I tried to get everything in, so I wanted to speak as quickly as possible so that I could do it. Please.
Thank you so much for that very detailed. Can you tell us about Simele a little bit? I know some members of the community, those representing the Assyrian Society are here today. They just returned from Iraq from their annual holiday. But do you know what happened to the website, to the site, the Simele site, and how is it preserved and maybe community members can?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you, Ravina. So the issue with Simele today is a little bit, let's go back here. It's a little bit problematic. It is it is part of a so here it is again today. So it's become a concern for Assyrians around the world because of the fact that it may not only be an archaeological place for ancient Assyrians, but it may also be, excuse me, a place, obviously, of genocide, or it is a place of genocide, and so there may be mass graves and other issues there. So Assyrians are very concerned about what may happen to it. The problem is currently today, it's also part of a larger archaeological survey project, and so the concern is what may be overlooked in order to get to some of the ancient stratigraphy. Now, typically archaeologists don't do that. I mean, they'll dig at layers, and so they know, what time periods things come from, and they're very careful. Fortunately or unfortunately for Assyrians in this case, I don't think that it's necessarily being done the proper way. At least there is not Assyrian representation with these archaeological digs at the moment, talking about this issue, and many people are aware of it. The archaeologists, are aware of it. But there's not a lot of local Assyrian civil society that's been involved, not for lack of trying, of course, but to be part of this. And there was a campaign that started in 2018, you saw the Assyrian Policy Institute, and it's been going on for a few years to try to get that recognition moving forward. But since we have people that were just there recently,
I was there actually 2 weeks ago, and the site is owned by a Kurdish. It's fenced, and we actually had to bribe ourselves to get in. We knew that Assyrians are interested in the site. We got in there, and it seems that part of it was dug up and was dug a huge hole. Very hard to stand by the edge of there and watch the whole thing. So we had to go around and go down to the hole to see what's in there. What I noticed, and I'm a civil engineer, I can tell one side, the pillars, next to it, there's a huge radio antenna standing there. The backfill of that area was done, over the time. It doesn't look like a natural soil, and it was just done in pieces over there. But there was also a huge sign right in the corner there indicating that's an archaeological site. In talking with people, I was told that about 2 years ago, a German mission had come in there and dug up and took a lot of bones from the site, but nobody seems to know what happened to that finding.
thank you.
Yeah. But as I said, it's unguarded, and the guy was just making money anytime he sees a bus come in, he knows they're coming from outside.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Very insightful, and for me it's new, and to learn all these details and shocking. My question is around how many people left in Iraq, and is there other people in other countries like in Iran and Syria or in Turkey, and do you also work with other communities like Yazidis? And again, how do you actually own your own story and the past, right? There may be other, it can be very overlooked. How do you try to own yourself? I think you covered a little bit, but what's your strategy as a community or group? And I have so many questions. Okay, the last, where do you get support from for this? Where's your allies, like countries or individuals, donors or sectors? Do you feel like you have support and awareness around this? Where?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. Would you say, I'm going to ask our community member, Assyrians left in Iraq today? Maybe 150,000?
There is no official census about this, but I read about 4 or 5 months ago, a British source said that around 120,000 of total Christians left in Iraq. And I don't think I think that's close to reality for everything else. Because I've seen the migration over the years. A good example of that, in 2006, in the city of Iraq, there's been going on an annual parade commemorating the Assyrian New Year. And Google source indicated that the numbers in 2006 or 2007 were around 60,000 people marching.
Sure.
I marched a couple of weeks ago, and my best estimate for that's almost half of that number.
Sure.
30,000. So that gives you an indication. And everybody in there, especially among the young people, you ask them, everybody's interested and mostly for economic reasons and lack of opportunities for them.
Sure.
So I met some in the hotel where we're staying. The guy who was waiting on us there turns out to be a recent graduate of mechanical engineering, and he was just waiting.
Sure.
Couldn't find a job. So that's good indication of where,
Yeah, there are very few Assyrians left in the region, overall. Of course, more Assyrians exist in diaspora today than exist in their homelands. So that's a simple reality. I don't know of any major Assyrian strategies to engage. I mean, Assyrians have always tried to engage with major power politics, or at least to get the ear of the major political players, to listen to them. Some occasions they've been successful, other occasions not so much so. There's some recognition in certain places, like here in Arizona. There are certain types of recognition at the state level that will occur. You can talk to the SAPO Center for that and speak with them more about it. The hard part is because there is no nation state that the Assyrians can turn to for aid that is their own. It makes it very difficult to sort of deal with this. With issues of the World War I genocide, Assyrians will work with Armenian and Greek organizations. That's very common. Scholars will work together on occasion. But there is this sort of still scaled suffering thing that goes on where it's, if I talk too much about another genocide, then I'm somehow lessening my own suffering, which is problematic, of course, but it exists. We see it very frequently. So there are strategies that are out there. I think more Assyrians simply need to work on this, and it's going to take time. Assyrians are still in survival mode, right? This is still occurring. They're still being forced out of their homeland. So until that stops, I don't know if there is a perfect strategy for them, unfortunately.
I think the challenge is because of the size of the populations, because they're too small. It is hard to raise awareness about it, or what's the biggest challenge? Or people are not simply interested in taking a lead on this, or
that's a great question too. I don't know. I mean, my honest answer is I don't know. I can say that I always said to my academic friends, well, in the academic world, of course, everything is objective, everything is cool, everything is detached. So who's going to work on Assyrians? And why would you work on Assyrians? Well, usually academics will find something they're interested in and also do it because there's funding. There's not much funding for Assyrian studies or Assyrian-oriented work. So then who's going to do it? Assyrians are in survival mode, right? When they can work and live and take care of their families, the next step might be, okay, they might become medical doctors or engineers. Okay. It's my generation that becomes, scholars. And even at that, I remember in my dissertation defense, I was asked, what did I learn? And one of my responses was, well, you'll always see me as an Assyrian first and an academic second. And that's not the same for others. So it depends. It depends on what group. It depends on the saturation in the academic world, because academia is, a business. It's an arena, just like any other arena, any other business. and it works and functions a particular way. So the sort of detached nature of, well, I'm simply an objective scholar talking about it, you don't quite have that as of yet. And so also, hopefully that starts to break down over time, because I think that, that is in and of itself a problem. So I think it's simply just going to take time. I think the world is obviously shifting and moving, and I think Assyrians are going to do that with the rest of the world, and it'll shift over time. But a particular strategy, I do not have one, unfortunately. I just keep saying, keep working, keep supporting people that are working on it, and that's all I can do. Please, go ahead.
I might have missed this, but what about the French words, actions, anything post-genocide or even today?
I'm sorry.
Is there any role in awareness or support or anything given the role that what you described in terms of French controlled Syria?
Oh, not specifically. I mean, the genocide was just recognized by the French government, but I think these are more just performative things that occur. Nothing really that I know of, and I will freely admit I haven't spent a lot of time in the French archives to do this. So that's another piece of work that someone can actually take on, is to spend some time looking through the French archives. Typically the British archives is the first thing everyone goes to, sometimes the American archives. People always say the Arabic stuff will be important, but most of the stuff in Iraq was done in English at the time too. So you can get away with a lot of your, the research in English. But of course, you do have some stuff from the French. I have not done any exhaustive research in that, but that's another great place for some people to work on. I'll be honest, I actually typically don't do a lot of work on this anymore. I find it to be stressful. I find it to be trauma-inducing and just exhausting. I don't want to, I personally, as an Assyrian, it's tiring for me. It's a weight on me every time I get up and talk about this stuff. I don't know, it's very difficult. I can say it, I can do it, I can create the performance, I can do all the research, but there's only so many times that you do it and you start to get a little frustrated and you say, how many times am I going to have to give this talk? How many times am I going to have to write this article for someone to say something, to mention it? My book on Reforging the Forgotten History, which there's a chapter on this, came out in 2015. A major book on Middle East history came out, let's see, it was 2021, and they talked about Simele. They referenced Husby. And I think my book is mentioned once, my chapter on Simele not mentioned at all. My frustration is just like, well, when the work is done, it's offered to you, you still don't look at it. So it's just, it gets to be frustrating after a while, which is, honest to God, why I sort of walk away and do some other things with my academic work. I do go back to this at times because, there's more stuff to learn about it, but it becomes fairly heavy, I will say. And if young Assyrians ask what they should work on, I almost always steer them clear of this. I work in animal shelters too, and there is a very real compassion fatigue that exists, right? There is a very real fatigue that we all feel, those of us who work on this type of subject. It's painful, whether or not you're part of that community. It's painful to work on. And so I don't know. I give a lot of credit to Safo Center and people who work on this type of work because it's not for everyone. I think it takes a particular type of person to actually spend that much time doing it over and over again. So, but it is positive when you do get some of the responses, I think, from, like, again, the French government at least acknowledging it, right? So one step is better than no steps. And, there's certainly more recognition today than there was in the past. So that's very positive. Here, go ahead.
Okay. This is a bit of an interesting question. For me, I've always viewed this event, and as I look into it more, it's kind of this turning point in Assyrian nationalism and how we kind of view it today, and how it's more centered on the Church of the East than it's ever been.
Sure.
So, don't get me wrong. A lot of people in the other churches that are very nationalistic, and that's great. But do you think the consequences of this and the expulsion of large pro-patriarchal factions from Iraq that kind of led other communities in Iraq that were, like, for example, Chaldean Catholics, from steering away from Assyrian nationalism, but previously they'd be
There you go.
into it? Yeah.
This is the one I didn't want to show. only because we didn't have the time to do it, but byproducts of Simele. We, the inhabitants of Telkif, Telespo, Batnaya, Bathol, express our sincere thanks and devotion to His Royal Majesty for the effective measures taken by the government to protect our villages during the rebellion undertaken by a band of ignorant Assyrians in the northern districts. So this was, so for those of you who don't know, because most of you don't know this, Telkif, Telespo, Batnaya, and Bathol are not Church of the East Assyrian villages. These are Chaldean Catholic villages. Okay, so they are still within the Assyrian people, but Assyrians go through a period of Arabization after Simele, and large numbers of Assyrians go through that period of Arabization. And with Arabization also came more fracturing of the community. Post Simele, you also have just a general balkanization that occurs. And so the Chaldean Catholics begin to pull away from this identity of being Assyrian. And why would you? Why would you when you're being attacked? Why, if to be Assyrian was to be killed, why would you be Assyrian? If it was enough to be Assyrian to be shot, wouldn't you not be Assyrian? Wouldn't you try your best to make sure that you were protected from that situation and your family was protected? And it was very easy, you know, there were already these issues that occurred within the community. I mean, some of these things for the Catholics, I mean, it was for a long time. This is from the Jacobites. I mean, the Jacobites and the Church of the East split, you know, 400s. So there's a lot of, you know, animosity that goes on within the different religious factions. And that's been going on for quite some time. But the fact that you draw away from being Assyrian altogether, this occurs during this time period. So yes, and I would also caution, not you, but I mean this in sort of a general sense. When Assyrians talk about any cultural Assyrian, anything, Assyrian, blah, immediately the response is, it's nationalism, right? And so I have to always take a step back and say, well, what do you mean by nationalism? Do you mean like a focus on the nation, meaning we're Assyrian and we care only about ourselves? What is the definition of nationalism? And I know you don't mean that. What you mean is Assyrian cultural awareness, Assyrian connection, the name, the identity. In the Assyrian case, among academics in particular, anytime you talk about Assyrians, the discussion, because of course nationalism is a very problematic term. So the minute you talk about Assyrians, they write it off, and I mean they, most scholars write it off as by saying, oh, these are Assyrians, they're being nationalistic. Anytime you talk about Assyrianism, it's nationalism. Most Assyrians you meet today that hang out in Phoenix, will probably just tell you they're Assyrian. And if you ask them if they wanted a country, some people might say, sure. Some people might say, I have a country, I live here. Some people might give you a totally different answer. They're not monolithic. And their sense of simply being Assyrian is not a nationalistic sense like we would define it in political science today. That's not what they mean. Right? That's the idea. So that's another problem, because immediately you say Assyrian and the assumption is, oh, there's nationalism involved. And of course, in the Assyrian case, when it's nationalism, it's a problematic issue. When it's another group and it's nationalism, it seems to be okay for the most part, if it's a small persecuted group. For the Assyrians, when you talk nationalism, it becomes this sort of give and take. Well, I don't know, you know, maybe they defended themselves too much and it becomes a problem. So I caution that nationalism term only because people take it the wrong way.
Yeah, I
Because of the
wasn't
misunderstanding.
meaning it in that sense. I was meaning
Sure.
it more as like
Identification.
this identification, which has come to mean so many things in our community. Like when she answered, why do we not, like what's our problem
Yes.
essentially? I think the first one is that we can't agree with each other on anything. And when you get 5 of us in a room, we'll argue.
Sure.
It's very Jewish.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, get the same. I mean, talk to Greeks; they'll say the same thing. I mean, my friend who's Greek will always joke that, you know, every group looks at other groups and looks at dysfunction in those groups and says, "Oh, you have it too." I mean, every community has
But
it.
the Greeks can all agree they're Greek. The Jews can all agree they're Jews.
Yes. So now, but definitions of that are actually numerous, right? What it means to be Jewish is not the same for every single person who's Jewish, right? So the case of the Assyrians The case of the Armenians, as well, to an extent, I would say, are similar in some ways because of the situation in the Middle East and the connection of ethnicity, culture, but also religious identity. And because with the Christian denominations of Assyrians and Armenians, it's almost like it became synonymous. So if you start talking about pseudo-Armenians or pseudo-Assyrians, like Muslim groups who live in places like Turkey, who call themselves Assyrian or Armenian, among Assyrians and Armenians who are Christian, who also have been persecuted in the Middle East for their religious identity, it's hard for them to accept that because they feel like, well, wait a minute, we were persecuted for being Christian and for being Assyrian. How do I reconcile that in my mind? So there is this sort of tug of war that kind of exists. And I think part of that is also the issue of recognition. With recognition, I think that some healing does occur. But I will also say that by no means were the Assyrians, not only were they not monolithic, they understood it. And when they went to the League of Nations, there were 4 to 5 distinct Assyrian groups that went to the League of Nations, all asking the League of Nations at 1919, the Paris Peace Conference, asking them for support for Assyrians. 5 different groups, 4 specific, and then arguably an individual. So, and they came from different areas, different countries, different ecclesiastical backgrounds, and most of the definitions included not just the Christian groups, but certain Muslim groups, Jews, and Yazidis. So people may not know this. There are numerous Jewish villages that existed in northern Iraq that spoke the exact same language as the Assyrians, and in fact, they intermarried. And so if you talk to these people, there's a document, Yaakov Maoz has this document, Dr. Yaakov Maoz in Israel has a document on the, it's called the Committee of the Assyrian Jews of Palestine. Before the sort of push of, oh, sorry, I know I'm running too long. Before the push of this idea of like Kurdish Jewry began to be a big thing, most of the Jews that left or were forced out of places like Iraq and Iran lived alongside Christian villages. They spoke the same language. And they all lived in what is called, the land of Ashur, right?
Traditionally, they were called Shwala, neighbors.
Neighbors, yeah, they were generally all part of that same fold. So Nashidida, yes, absolutely. So this was a very typical thing. Now it's changed over time, but if you have a chance, look at the work of Yaakov Maoz, if anyone's ever heard of it. That's come up more recently to talk about sort of the identification of these groups. There is work with the Yazidis as well, and I would also say, if anyone's interested in groups, sort of like the crypto-Assyrians, I should say, in Turkey, there are those groups as well, and you can find them in places like Diyarbakir. So they definitely do exist, and I would certainly suggest to folks to have a look at that. And I apologize, I know I've gone way too long.
No. But thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, guys.